In the autumn of 1891, when Deputy Marshal Thomas Hartwell opened the registry logbook of Hollow Creek Cemetery in rural Oregon, his hands trembled as he stared at the final entry. The last recorded burial was dated September 15, 1888, nearly 3 years earlier, yet the cemetery grounds told a different story entirely. Fresh graves dotted the hillside, weathered headstones bore recent dates, and the soil still showed signs of regular digging. Someone had been burying bodies in consecrated ground without keeping any official records. The question that would haunt Hartwell for the rest of his days was simple yet terrifying. Who were these people being buried in secret, and why had someone gone to such lengths to erase all trace of their existence? Before we delve deeper into the mystery that consumed the small community of Millbrook, Oregon, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our darkest stories. Also, please let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We love hearing from our international audience. Your support helps us bring you these chilling tales from history's shadows. What Deputy Marshal Hartwell discovered that grey October morning would eventually unravel one of the most sinister criminal conspiracies in Oregon's territorial history. According to the fragmented testimonies and whispered confessions that would later emerge, the truth behind Hollow Creek Cemetery's missing records began 3 years earlier when an honest man's curiosity cost him his life. Millbrook, Oregon, in 1888, was a town caught between two worlds. Located in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, roughly 30 miles southeast of Salem, this community of 800 souls had grown around a lumber mill and the promise of the railroad that would eventually connect them to Portland. The town bore all the characteristics of the American frontier: wide dirt streets that turned to mud in the rainy season, wooden sidewalks that creaked underfoot, and buildings that seemed to spring up overnight to meet the demands of a growing population. The community was predominantly Protestant, with a modest, white-clappered church that served multiple denominations on rotating Sundays. Reverend William Matthews, a man in his 50s who had traveled west from Pennsylvania, held services for Methodists, Baptists, and the occasional Presbyterian who found themselves in Millbrook's embrace. The town's moral fabric was woven tight by necessity. In a place where the nearest law enforcement was a day's ride away, neighbors had to trust neighbors, and reputation meant everything. Hollow Creek Cemetery sat on a gentle rise overlooking the town. Established in 1882, when the first permanent residents decided they needed a proper burial ground rather than the scattered family plots that had served the earliest settlers. The cemetery took its name from the seasonal creek that ran along its eastern border, a waterway that flowed strong during the spring melt but reduced to a whisper by late summer. Ancient Douglas fir trees provided natural boundaries on 3 sides, their towering presence lending an air of solemnity to the grounds. Samuel Creek, no relation to the waterway despite the coincidental name, had served as the cemetery's caretaker since its founding. A meticulous man in his early 40s, Samuel had emigrated from Ohio with his wife Martha and their 2 young children in 1881, drawn by promises of affordable land and steady work. His previous experience as a groundskeeper at a cemetery in Columbus had made him the natural choice when Millbrook's town council decided they needed someone to maintain their burial grounds properly. Samuel took pride in his work with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. He kept detailed records of every burial, noting not just the deceased's name and date of death, but also the exact plot location, the condition of the gravesite, and even observations about the funeral attendants. His handwriting was precise and careful, each entry in the leather-bound logbook a testament to his belief that the dead deserved dignity and proper documentation. He viewed himself as the guardian of Millbrook's history, the keeper of records that future generations would rely upon to understand their heritage. Martha Creek often told her neighbors that Samuel would spend his evenings reviewing his cemetery records, cross-referencing burial plots with his hand-drawn maps, ensuring that every detail was accurate. He had even begun the practice of photographing headstones with a box camera he had purchased from a traveling merchant, creating a visual record to complement his written documentation. This attention to detail, which his wife found endearing if somewhat excessive, would prove to be both his greatest strength and ultimately his downfall. The town's other key figure in this story was Harold Wickham, a man whose arrival in Millbrook had coincided with the cemetery's establishment. Wickham served as the cemetery's official administrator, responsible for selling plots, collecting fees, and ensuring that all legal requirements were met for burials within the town limits. A heavy-set man with graying whiskers and a tendency toward expensive clothing that seemed out of place in frontier Oregon, Wickham had claimed to be a former clerk from San Francisco who sought the quieter life of a smaller community. Wickham's office occupied a corner of the town's general store, where he conducted cemetery business 3 days a week. The rest of his time was supposedly devoted to various business investments around the territory, though the exact nature of these enterprises remained vague when anyone inquired. He owned a modest house on Millbrook's Main Street and was known for his generous donations to the church, which had earned him a respected position in the community despite his relative newcomer status. The events that would eventually expose the dark truth began on a humid evening in early September 1888. Samuel Creek was making his usual evening rounds through the cemetery, checking on recent graves and ensuring that no animals had disturbed the grounds during the day. The setting sun cast long shadows between the headstones as he walked the familiar paths, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves that had begun to gather as autumn approached. As Samuel approached the newer section of the cemetery, where burials from the past year were located, he noticed something that made him pause. Fresh earth was piled beside a plot that, according to his meticulous records, should have been empty. He pulled out his small notebook and consulted his hand-drawn map by the fading light. Plot 47B was definitely supposed to be unoccupied. He had marked it as available just 2 weeks earlier when Mrs. Patterson had inquired about purchasing it for her ailing husband. Samuel's first thought was that Harold Wickham had sold the plot without informing him, a breach of their usual procedure, but not unprecedented. Wickham occasionally forgot to notify Samuel of new sales, leading to minor confusion that was usually resolved with a simple conversation. But as Samuel examined the burial site more closely, his confusion deepened into concern. The grave had been dug and filled with obvious haste. The earth was packed down unevenly, and there was no headstone or temporary marker to identify the deceased. More troubling still, the wooden coffin had been buried unusually shallow. Samuel could actually make out the outline of the casket beneath the thin layer of soil. In his 6 years of cemetery work, he had never seen such sloppy craftsmanship. Samuel spent the next morning reviewing his records once more, hoping to find some notation he had missed. When that search proved fruitless, he walked into town to speak with Harold Wickham directly. He found the administrator in his usual spot at the general store, reviewing what appeared to be financial ledgers. "Harold," Samuel began, removing his hat as he approached the desk, "I need to speak with you about plot 47B. There's been a burial there, but I don't have any record of it." Wickham looked up from his papers with an expression that Samuel later described to his wife as peculiar, a mixture of surprise and what might have been guilt. "Plot 47B, are you certain about the location?" "I've mapped every inch of that cemetery, Harold. I know exactly where 47B is located, and someone's been buried there without proper documentation." Wickham was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the wooden desk. Finally, he said, "It was a last-minute burial, family emergency. I handled the paperwork myself and forgot to inform you. I'll get you the details later this week." Samuel left the meeting feeling unsettled, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. Wickham's explanation was plausible, but something about the man's manner had been off. The administrator had avoided eye contact and seemed eager to end the conversation. More concerning was the fact that Wickham had claimed to handle the burial personally, something that had never happened in all their years of working together. 3 days later, when Samuel asked about the promised documentation, Wickham claimed he was still gathering the necessary papers from the family. A week after that, the story had changed to complications with the deceased's estate. By the end of September, Wickham was actively avoiding Samuel's questions, claiming he was too busy with other matters to discuss cemetery business. It was during this period of growing suspicion that Samuel began to notice other irregularities. Walking through the cemetery on a foggy morning in early October, he spotted 2 men he didn't recognize digging a grave in a section that should have been full, according to his records. When he approached them, they claimed to be working under Wickham's direct orders and refused to provide any additional information. Samuel's methodical nature, which had served him so well in maintaining cemetery records, now drove him to investigate these anomalies systematically. He began making notes of every unfamiliar face he encountered on the cemetery grounds, documenting times and dates when burials occurred without his knowledge. His leather-bound logbook, once filled only with official burial records, now contained a growing collection of observations about suspicious activities. The weeks following Samuel's initial discovery transformed his routine from peaceful maintenance work into something resembling detective work. His wife Martha noticed the change immediately. Samuel had always been methodical, but now he seemed obsessed, staying awake late into the evening, poring over his cemetery maps and notes. "You're worrying yourself sick over this," Martha told him one evening as he sat at their kitchen table, trying to reconcile his official burial records with the growing number of unmarked graves he had discovered. Perhaps Mr. Wickham simply has a different way of handling the paperwork. But Samuel's concerns went deeper than mere administrative confusion. By late October, he had identified at least 7 burial sites that existed without any corresponding documentation in his logbook. More disturbing still, these graves shared certain characteristics that separated them from the legitimate burials he oversaw. They were all dug hastily and shallowly, none bore headstones or markers, and they were concentrated in the newer sections of the cemetery where casual visitors were less likely to notice irregularities. Samuel's investigation took on greater urgency when he encountered Jake Morrison, a drifter who occasionally did odd jobs around Millbrook. Morrison approached Samuel one evening as he was closing the cemetery gates, looking nervous and constantly glancing over his shoulder. "Mr. Creek," Morrison said in a low voice, "I need to tell you something about the work I've been doing for Mr. Wickham." Morrison explained that Wickham had hired him and several other transient workers to dig graves during nighttime hours, always with strict instructions to avoid speaking with Samuel or anyone else about their activities. The pay was unusually generous, 3 times what such work typically commanded, but came with ominous warnings about the consequences of talking about their employment. "He said it was all legal and proper," Morrison continued, "but something about the whole arrangement felt wrong. The bodies, they didn't come with funeral processions or mourning families, just men bringing wooden boxes in the middle of the night, wanting them buried quick and quiet." Samuel pressed Morrison for more details, learning that these nighttime burials had been occurring regularly for several months. The workers were typically contacted through intermediaries and given specific instructions about which plots to dig and when to do the work. Payment was always in cash, and Wickham personally supervised many of the burials to ensure they were completed according to his specifications. Most disturbing of all was Morrison's description of the men who brought the bodies. They didn't behave like grieving family members or professional undertakers. Instead, they seemed anxious to complete the burials as quickly as possible, often arriving and departing under cover of darkness. Morrison had overheard fragments of conversation suggesting that some of these men were traveling significant distances to reach Millbrook, coming from as far away as Portland and Eugene. Armed with this information, Samuel began to piece together a pattern that chilled him to the bone. The unauthorized burials weren't simply a matter of administrative oversight or unconventional funeral practices. Someone was using Hollow Creek Cemetery as a disposal site, burying bodies that were never meant to be found or officially recorded. Samuel's next step was to approach Reverend Matthews, hoping that the minister might have knowledge of families who had requested unusual burial arrangements. The Reverend's response only deepened the mystery. "I haven't performed funeral services for anyone buried in Hollow Creek for over 2 months," Matthews told Samuel during a private meeting in the church vestry. "And I certainly haven't been involved in any nighttime burials or ceremonies involving unmarked graves." This revelation forced Samuel to confront a terrifying possibility. The bodies being buried in his cemetery weren't dying from natural causes or legitimate accidents. The secrecy, the generous payments to workers, the involvement of men from distant cities, all pointed towards something far more sinister than irregular paperwork. Samuel made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. He would continue documenting these illegal burials, gathering enough evidence to present to territorial authorities who could investigate properly. He began carrying a small camera during his evening rounds, photographing the suspicious grave sites and keeping detailed notes about the men he observed conducting these clandestine operations. Throughout November 1888, Samuel's covert investigation revealed the scope of what was happening at Hollow Creek Cemetery. His documentation showed that unauthorized burials were occurring at a rate of roughly 2 per week, always following the same pattern: nighttime arrival of unknown men with simple wooden coffins, hasty burial in predetermined plots, and immediate departure without any religious ceremony or mourning rituals. Samuel's photography efforts, while limited by the technology of the era, provided visual evidence of the unmarked graves and the poor quality of the burial work. More importantly, his patient observation allowed him to identify several of the men involved in these operations. He recognized at least 3 individuals who made multiple visits to the cemetery, suggesting they were part of an organized group rather than isolated incidents. The breakthrough in Samuel's investigation came when he overheard a conversation between Harold Wickham and a stranger outside the general store. Hidden in the shadow of a nearby building, Samuel listened as the 2 men discussed payment schedules and delivery arrangements, using language that left little doubt about the criminal nature of their activities. "The Portland shipments are becoming too frequent," the stranger said. "People in that city are starting to ask questions about the disappearances." Wickham's response was equally damning. "We can handle twice the current volume if necessary. The cemetery has plenty of space, and the locals don't pay attention to what happens after dark." The stranger, whom Samuel later learned was named Dutch Henley, expressed concerns about the quality of the burial work. "Some of these graves are so shallow that heavy rain could expose the contents. We need your man to dig deeper, or we'll have to find another location." "Samuel Creek is becoming a problem," Wickham admitted. "He's asking too many questions and keeping records that could cause trouble if they fell into the wrong hands." Samuel's blood ran cold as he realized that his investigation had not gone unnoticed. The men were aware of his curiosity and viewed him as a threat to their operation. More terrifying still was the implication that they were prepared to take action to protect their secret. Despite the obvious danger, Samuel continued his documentation efforts, driven by a sense of duty to the victims who had been denied proper burial and official recognition. His evening photographs now included images of the men conducting these illegal operations, though the poor lighting and primitive camera technology made positive identification difficult. Samuel's wife, Martha, grew increasingly worried about her husband's behavior during this period. He had become secretive and paranoid, constantly checking to ensure he wasn't being followed and speaking in hushed tones even within their own home. When she pressed him for explanations, Samuel would only say that he had discovered something that required careful handling by proper authorities. "I can't involve you in this, Martha," he told her one evening after she found him cleaning his rifle. something he had never done since arriving in Millbrook. "If anything happens to me, you need to take the children and go stay with your sister in Sacramento until this matter is resolved." Martha's fears proved prophetic when Samuel failed to return from his evening cemetery rounds on December 3rd, 1888. She waited until well past midnight before walking to the Hendersons' house to ask for help searching for her husband. A group of men with lanterns scoured the cemetery grounds and surrounding forest, calling Samuel's name and checking every possible location where he might have encountered trouble. They found Samuel's body at dawn, lying face down in Hollow Creek itself, his head bearing obvious signs of blunt force trauma. His camera was missing, as was the notebook he always carried during his evening rounds. The leather-bound logbook that contained his official cemetery records was discovered floating in the creek, several yards downstream, its pages ruined by water damage, but still recognizable. Dr. Harrison Webb, who served as Millbrook's physician and unofficial coroner, examined Samuel's body and determined that death had resulted from multiple blows to the head with a heavy object, possibly a shovel or similar tool. The positioning of the body suggested that Samuel had been attacked elsewhere and then dragged to the creek, presumably to make the death appear accidental. Harold Wickham expressed appropriate shock and sorrow at Samuel's death, offering to help Martha with funeral arrangements and even volunteering to temporarily oversee cemetery maintenance until a replacement could be found. His performance was convincing enough that most of Millbrook's residents accepted the tragedy as a terrible accident. Perhaps Samuel had fallen and struck his head on the rocky creek bed during his evening rounds. The days following Samuel Creek's funeral revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had cost him his life. Martha Creek, devastated by her husband's death but suspicious of the circumstances, made a discovery that would eventually expose the entire criminal operation. While packing Samuel's personal effects, Martha found a hidden compartment in his desk containing photographs, detailed notes, and a hand-drawn map marking the locations of unauthorized graves. Samuel had been more thorough in his investigation than anyone realized, documenting not just the illegal burials, but also the identities of several men involved in the operation. Among Samuel's hidden materials was a letter he had begun writing to the territorial marshal in Salem, outlining his suspicions about the cemetery being used for illegal body disposal. The letter was unfinished, suggesting that Samuel had been killed before he could mail his report to authorities. Most damning of all was a photograph that clearly showed Harold Wickham supervising the burial of an unmarked coffin, proving his direct involvement in the criminal conspiracy. Martha faced a terrible dilemma. She possessed evidence that could expose her husband's killers, but she also understood that these men had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their secret. With 2 young children to consider, Martha made the painful decision to hide Samuel's evidence rather than risk becoming the next victim. However, Martha's caution couldn't prevent other developments that would eventually unravel the conspiracy. Samuel's replacement as cemetery caretaker was a man named Robert Walsh, recently arrived from California with excellent references and an eagerness to begin work immediately. Walsh's hiring had been expedited by Harold Wickham, who claimed that the cemetery needed immediate attention to maintain its reputation. What the residents of Millbrook didn't know was that Robert Walsh was actually Dutch Henley, the man Samuel had overheard discussing the illegal burial operation with Wickham. The real Robert Walsh had never reached Oregon, having met with an unfortunate accident during his journey west. Henley had assumed Walsh's identity and presented forged credentials to secure the cemetery position, ensuring that the illegal burials could continue without interruption. Under Henley's management, the pace of unauthorized burials accelerated dramatically. The new caretaker showed none of Samuel's obsessive attention to record-keeping, claiming that he preferred a more streamlined approach to cemetery administration. The official logbook remained largely empty, while the number of fresh graves continued to multiply across the cemetery grounds. Henley's arrival also coincided with an increase in suspicious deaths throughout the surrounding region. Traveling merchants, prospectors, and other transients began disappearing at an alarming rate, their bodies eventually finding their way to unmarked graves in Hollow Creek Cemetery. The criminal network had evolved from merely disposing of bodies to actively creating them, targeting victims who were unlikely to be missed by local communities. The operation's success bred overconfidence among its participants. Wickham began spending money more freely, purchasing expensive clothing and furnishings that seemed inconsistent with his official income as a cemetery administrator. He also started recruiting additional accomplices from among Millbrook's less respectable residents, offering generous payments for simple tasks like digging graves or transporting mysterious cargo. This expansion of the criminal network would prove to be its downfall. One of Wickham's new recruits, a young man named Peter Kowalski, who had fallen on hard times after losing his job at the lumber mill, began to have second thoughts about his involvement when he realized the true nature of the work he was being asked to perform. Kowalski's crisis of conscience intensified when he recognized one of the bodies being buried as a traveling preacher who had stayed at his family's boarding house just days earlier. The preacher had been a healthy man in his 50s, showing no signs of illness or injury when he departed Millbrook. Yet here he was, dead under suspicious circumstances and destined for an unmarked grave. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable for Kowalski, who sought guidance from Reverend Matthews during a private confession session. The young man's stammering account of nighttime burials and suspicious deaths initially struck the Reverend as the product of guilt and imagination, but Matthews became increasingly concerned as Kowalski provided specific details that could be verified. Reverend Matthews faced his own moral dilemma. The sanctity of confession prevented him from directly reporting Kowalski's revelations to authorities, but his duty to the community demanded some form of action. Matthews chose a middle path, encouraging Kowalski to come forward voluntarily while beginning his own discreet investigation into the cemetery's recent activities. Can you imagine the terror of realizing that your own community's sacred burial ground has become a dumping site for murder victims? If this story is chilling you to the bone, please share it with someone who appreciates true crime mysteries. Give us a like to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our darkest investigations. Let's discover together how this web of murder and corruption finally came to light. The exposure of the Hollow Creek Cemetery conspiracy began with an unexpected event that the criminals couldn't control or cover up. On March 15th, 1891, heavy spring rains caused Hollow Creek to overflow its banks for the first time in over a decade. The flooding was severe enough to wash out several roads and damage buildings in lower areas of Millbrook, but its most horrifying consequence was the exposure of numerous shallow graves in the cemetery. The floodwaters eroded soil from dozens of burial sites, revealing coffins and human remains that had been hastily interred without proper depth or preparation. Residents who ventured to check on flood damage at the cemetery discovered a scene of horror. Skeletal remains, rotting coffins, and clothing scattered across the grounds by the receding waters. Deputy Marshal Thomas Hartwell arrived from Salem 3 days later to investigate reports of the disturbing discoveries. His examination of the cemetery grounds revealed clear evidence of improper burial practices, but more importantly, it exposed the discrepancy between the number of bodies found and the sparse entries in the official logbook. Hartwell's investigation quickly focused on Robert Walsh, whose nervous behavior and contradictory statements raised immediate suspicions. When pressed for documentation of the numerous unmarked graves, Walsh claimed that records had been lost in various accidents and administrative oversights. His inability to provide coherent explanations for the cemetery's condition led Hartwell to place him under arrest pending further investigation. Under interrogation, the man calling himself Robert Walsh initially maintained his false identity and claimed ignorance about the illegal burials. However, when Hartwell threatened to telegraph California authorities to verify his credentials, Dutch Henley finally confessed to his true identity and his role in the criminal operation. Henley's confession revealed a network of criminals that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. The operation had begun as a simple body disposal service for criminals in Portland and Eugene who needed to eliminate evidence of their activities. Harold Wickham had been recruited due to his position as cemetery administrator and his willingness to ignore legal procedures for sufficient payment. The network had evolved over time to include active murder for profit. Traveling merchants and prospectors were targeted for their money and goods, killed either during robberies or lured to remote locations under false pretenses. Their bodies were then transported to Hollow Creek Cemetery for disposal, with their deaths attributed to accidents or disappearances that wouldn't trigger intensive investigations. Samuel Creek had become a target when his meticulous record-keeping threatened to expose the discrepancies in official burial documentation. Wickham had initially hoped to discourage Samuel's curiosity through misdirection and delays, but the caretaker's persistent investigation eventually necessitated more drastic action. Henley described Samuel's murder in clinical detail during his confession. The caretaker had been approached by multiple men while conducting his evening rounds, ostensibly to discuss cemetery business. When Samuel refused to abandon his investigation and threatened to contact territorial authorities, he was struck down with a shovel and his body disposed of in the creek to simulate an accidental death. The confession also revealed the fate of Samuel's missing camera and notebook. These items had been destroyed immediately after the murder to eliminate evidence of his investigation. However, the killers had been unaware of the additional documentation Samuel had hidden in his home, evidence that remained in Martha Creek's possession. Deputy Marshal Hartwell's investigation expanded rapidly as Henley provided names and details of other conspirators. Harold Wickham was arrested at his home, where searchers discovered a substantial cache of money and stolen goods taken from murdered victims. Several other Millbrook residents were implicated as accomplices, including men who had dug graves and transported bodies without asking questions about the nature of their work. Peter Kowalski, whose crisis of conscience had prompted Reverend Matthews to contact authorities, was granted leniency in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. His testimony helped establish the timeline of the criminal operation and provided crucial details about specific murders that might otherwise have remained unsolved. The scope of the conspiracy became clear as investigators exhumed and examined the unauthorized graves. Over 40 bodies were recovered from unmarked burial sites, representing victims from across Oregon and Northern California. Many showed signs of violent death, contradicting any theory that the cemetery had been used merely for disposing of natural deaths that occurred outside proper legal channels. The trials that followed the exposure of the Hollow Creek Cemetery conspiracy consumed most of 1892, drawing newspaper coverage from across the Pacific Northwest. Harold Wickham and Dutch Henley were both convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Their executions, carried out in Salem on February 14, 1893, drew crowds of spectators who had followed the case since its initial exposure. Several accomplices received prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement in the murders versus the body disposal operation. Peter Kowalski, whose cooperation had been essential to securing convictions, served only 6 months in jail and was subsequently relocated to another territory under an assumed name for his protection. Martha Creek played a crucial role in the prosecutions by finally revealing her husband's hidden investigation materials. Samuel's photographs and notes provided evidence that corroborated witness testimony and helped establish the timeline of criminal activities. Martha testified at multiple trials, describing her husband's growing concerns about cemetery irregularities and his determination to expose the truth despite obvious personal danger. The investigation also solved numerous missing person cases that had baffled authorities throughout Oregon and Northern California. Families who had lost loved ones to unexplained disappearances finally learned the fate of their relatives, though the knowledge brought little comfort given the horrific circumstances of their deaths. Hollow Creek Cemetery was closed indefinitely following the trials, deemed too contaminated by criminal activity for continued use as a burial ground. The legitimate graves were eventually relocated to a new cemetery established on the opposite side of Millbrook, while the site of the original cemetery was abandoned to nature. Within a few years, Douglas fir saplings had begun to reclaim the grounds, gradually obscuring the scene of one of Oregon's most disturbing criminal conspiracies. The town of Millbrook never fully recovered from the scandal. Many families relocated to other communities, unable to live with the knowledge of what had occurred in their midst. The lumber mill closed in 1895, partly due to economic factors, but also because of the community's damaged reputation. By 1900, Millbrook had dwindled to fewer than 200 residents, a shadow of its former self. Reverend Matthews remained in the community until his death in 1903, dedicating his remaining years to helping survivors cope with the trauma of learning that their trusted neighbors had been involved in systematic murder. His sermons during this period frequently addressed themes of evil hiding beneath respectable facades and the importance of moral courage in confronting uncomfortable truths. The case established important precedents for territorial law enforcement, demonstrating the need for better coordination between communities when investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The Hollow Creek conspiracy had succeeded partly because isolated communities like Millbrook lacked the resources and connections to detect sophisticated criminal operations that exploited their remoteness. Deputy Marshal Thomas Hartwell's investigation methods became a model for future cases involving organized crime in frontier communities. His systematic approach to examining physical evidence, cross-referencing witness testimony, and pursuing leads across multiple jurisdictions helped establish protocols that would serve law enforcement well into the 20th century. Martha Creek remarried in 1894 to a farmer from the Willamette Valley, taking her children to start a new life far from the memories of Hollow Creek Cemetery. She kept Samuel's original logbook as a memento of his dedication to truth and justice, occasionally sharing the story with her grandchildren as an example of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it involves personal risk. The leather-bound logbook that Samuel Creek had maintained with such meticulous care was eventually donated to the Oregon Historical Society, where it remains as a testament to one man's fatal commitment to documenting the truth. The final entry, dated September 15, 1888, marks not just the end of legitimate cemetery operations, but the beginning of a period when Hollow Creek became a dumping ground for the victims of a criminal conspiracy that valued profit over human life. This haunting case reminds us that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places, hidden behind facades of respectability and community trust. Samuel Creek's dedication to maintaining accurate records ultimately cost him his life, but it also provided the evidence necessary to expose a network of killers who might otherwise have continued their deadly work indefinitely. What do you think about this tragic story of one man's courage in the face of overwhelming danger? Do you believe there are other similar cases from history that remain undiscovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with others who appreciate true stories from America's dark past. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried.